Mike, you are in the Army for going on 22 years now, almost there. By the time people watch this, it'll have passed. But what caused you to enter the military?
Man, kind of a long story. I'll try to keep it short. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Coming out of high school, kind of always had, the trajectory of the normal American high schooler, right? Finish high school, go straight to college. I was always kind of the nerdy kid, so to speak, in high school. Had pretty strict parents as far as academics went. And family circumstances kind of led me down this path, right? So it came from a family situation where parents were divorced when I was in middle school, early middle school. Not a huge thing, it happens. And then started high school at one high school in the home that I kind of grew up in. My mom, though, she got remarried, bought a new house, different school district. So I went to a second high school for the start of my sophomore year. And then my stepdad and I were having some interpersonal conflict, right?
Yeah.
And we weren't getting along very well. So I asked if I could go live with my dad, who at the time was living in Chicago, just outside of Chicago in a suburb called Aurora. So I ended up moving out there. So I kind of finished the second half of my sophomore year with him, and then spent my whole junior year in that high school, and really loved it there. I fit in there well, got along with people really well there. It was someplace that I felt real comfortable. And towards the end of my junior year, my dad got a job transfer back to Ohio. And so I ended up going to a fourth high school my senior year. And so kind of at that point, it became like, man, I do not want to go to another school, right? Like, I don't want to go to college anymore. It's not fun to me anymore. And so I was looking for an escape route, so to speak, right? Military had never been talked about before. In my family, my granddads were both in the military. One was in the Air Force. The other one was in the Army, like post World War II, right after World War II, and just prior to the Korean War. So they were kind of the in-between. But other than that, no other military history. And met an Army recruiter one day at the high school. And I was like, this sounds kind of interesting. So that's what kind of led me down that path. And my parents were super, super pissed. Like they were not supportive of that choice at all. I was only 17, so they had to sign parental consent for me to join. But that was a whole nother battle, and finally was able to convince them that this was what I wanted to do. And so I joined into the delayed entry program as a senior in high school in February of 2001. And on June 19th was when I showed up to Fort Knox, Kentucky, which is actually where I am right now. I'm here at Fort Knox, Kentucky right now for a work, conference this week. So it's interesting how, life is always kind of bringing you back to these places that you've been before sometimes. So that's kind of how I ended up getting into the Army to start with.
That's legitimately full circle from 22 years ago. Here you are again. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's wild. And actually I went for a run this morning with the division sergeant major and another battalion sergeant major. And we left from the division headquarters and we ran down to this hill. So Fort Knox, Kentucky has three big famous hills, right? Misery, Agony, and Heartbreak. And they are beasts. And so when we took off from the run this morning, the division Sergeant Major Monday, he was like, hey, where do you guys want to go? And I was like, well, hey, let's just kind of see where things take us. And he goes, well, let's go run Misery. And I was like, oh man, that's a beast. And it was for sure. So
that's too funny, man. Now you're a command sergeant major, and I probably would have been easier just to fly up that hill instead of running it, right? You got your you've gotten your pilot's license. Tell us about that.
So So I grew up in, in central Ohio, and my grandfather, he owned a banner towing company. So where planes tow the big signs behind them. Uh, and so, from as far back as I can remember, time was spent in the summertime out at the airport, working. There was a family business, right? A family operation. So, my grandpa and my uncle would fly, and then the rest of us, we'd be down on the ground crew. And, some of the best memories that I have of my childhood, we're spending time with my grandfather either at the airport or in the hangar, or at his house. He had a big, huge pole barn, right? And it was called the banner barn. So that's where all of the banners were hung up at, and that's where they all got built at and prepped to go fly. And so, I really learned how to fly an airplane before, long before I could fly, before I could drive a car. I think, I was probably around 12 years old, and that was the first time that I ever got to fly an airplane from start to finish on a trip. My granddad, of course, is with me. He's sitting in the other seat.
Yeah.
But that was the first time that I can remember ever getting in an airplane and him, letting me do everything kind of from start to finish without him ever having to touch controls. So it was something that I grew up with. It really shaped kind of who I was as a person, what kind of things I was interested in. It's really what's driven me into like math and science and things like that. So when all of the family turmoil happened when I was a high schooler, I was kind of on this path of like, I'm going to go get my pilot's license, by the time I'm 16. Well, then I moved to Chicago, right? So
Yeah.
I lost that kind of access. And then I joined the military. So then I joined the Army, and then I deployed to Iraq, and, life happens. And so all of that took kind of a back burner. Well, then, COVID happened. And COVID happened right when I was going to the Sergeant's Major Academy. So I went to Fort Bliss, Texas. And when we got there, a lot of guys go and they finish a bachelor's degree or they get a master's degree. And I had already done all of that. So I went to the academy with a master's degree already in hand. So I was kind of like, well, what do I do with my spare time, right? I don't have any soldiers to look after. And other than my normal coursework for the academy, other than that, there wasn't anything else really going on, especially because of COVID, right? We were all locked down. We couldn't really go to a whole lot of different places. And my wife was like, well, why don't you get your pilot's license? And so I did. So I started that, back up, and found a great flight school in El Paso. And when I walked in, my flight instructor that I got paired up with at this school, his name's Adrian. He's like, hey, we'll start you off in a simulator. Do you have any prior experience in airplanes? And I was like, well, yeah, here's the deal. And I told him kind of that whole story. And he's like, oh, okay, so you kind of know what you're doing. And I was like, yeah, but look, man, I want to approach this like from a base zero, right? Like pretend like I don't know anything. And the first time that I went flying with him, he's like, look, man, I can't treat you like you don't know anything, because you already know how to fly the damn airplanes. Like you're going to be just fine. So yeah, I was able to get my pilot's license pretty quickly. And then since then, have been spending a lot of time out flying, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming. So kind of all over the American Central West. And it's some of the best areas to fly in, man. It's fantastic.
And I hear if you can fly where there's mountains like the Rockies, you can fly pretty much anywhere, right?
Yeah, so it's a whole different type of flying, right? Like you have to think about a whole lot of other things that you don't really have to think about when you're down, at lower elevations. So the higher elevations you get, the less air there is, and there's a whole lot of different aerodynamic factors that you got to think about. And then the mountains add a whole nother complexity with weather and just really having to think ahead and kind of stay, on your toes to keep yourself from getting into any kind of trouble.
Yeah, no, that's super cool, man. I mean, I would love to someday get my own pilot's license. So that's, motivation for, I'm sure, a lot of people who might see this to say, wow, I didn't know I could do that. Um, what's We're gonna get into some of that fitness stuff, but I imagine flying does a lot of the same things to you as like running does, right?
Yeah, yeah, it does, right? So like, yeah, you're not going to be out of breath necessarily, right? But like, um, there's for me, it's like a cathartic kind of experience. So um, let's say I have a terrible week at work, right? Just nothing kind of goes right, or a little bit of extra stress or whatever. Um, I get in an airplane and all of that stuff kind of just fades away, right? Because you have to concentrate on this task of flying an airplane and not killing yourself,
Right.
because they will, right? I mean, an airplane will kill you very easily if you're not careful.
Yep.
So, there have been times where, I live in Denver. My wife, she lives at our house down in the Durango area, so southwestern corner of Colorado. And that's about a 6-hour drive. But I can hop in the airplane after work and be home in 2 hours,
Hmm.
and in that 2 hour span of time, I'm not really thinking about anything with work. I'm not thinking about, what happened that day. I'm not, planning on, or what kind of things do I have to do next week or whatever. I can really just get in the airplane, focus on flying the airplane, and really just kind of enjoy the the scenery of the mountains, and just kind of let it all go, right? And that's something that running does for me too, to where when you're running, like, you don't really have time to think about all of the other nonsense that's going on. You can escape all of that stuff for an hour or however long you go run. When I was running marathons for 3 or 4 hours, you're just focused on the next step, and you're breathing, and it's like, it has all of those good things that things like meditation or yoga has,
Yeah.
to where it allows you to just kind of recenter yourself, and really just kind of take stock of who you are as a person, or just kind of relax, and it calms your mind, and that's really how I got into running kind of in the first place, right? Because I work in a high pressure job, lots of stress.
Mhm.
I've dealt with, the results of combat, and all of the baggage and bullshit that goes along with that. But these types of things help me to find a healthy release for all of that built up tension.
What are some of the other things in your world, I guess, that it seems like you've done a lot of that for yourself. You don't just have one thing, but what are some of the others?
Yeah. So, I anything in the open outdoors is huge for who I am as a person. I grew up, again, a lot of this maybe comes from my upbringing. I grew up in a family that my dad hunted, whitetail. He was a big bass fisherman, in Ohio. Go up to Lake Erie and fish for walleye. All of those types of things. So I kind of already had all of that stuff that I had been exposed to. And when I became an adult, and especially when I came back from combat, and it was really the second deployment, when I came back from that, I went right out onto the recruiting, trail, as far as being in this high pressure, high performance kind of environment. That's really where all of that stuff started to come into play, because I was having a difficult time with managing my own internal turmoil, right? Like, I've never been like officially diagnosed as somebody with PTSD, and that's probably just because I haven't sought out that type of treatment. I've kind of found ways to kind of just treat myself again through those healthy kinds of things, that get me out and get me in a better headspace. So yeah, so like, in the summertime, I spend as much time as possible outside, either hiking or rock climbing or whatever. as the summer wears on here and we get into August and September, it'll turn into scouting season. Right now, June and July is firewood cutting season for the house. So we'll cut probably 10 cords of firewood between me and the wife at the house, and that's what we use for heat all winter. So all of those types of things, again, are just huge releases of this pent up like frustration or anxiety or stress or whatever you want to call it. And really they're things that I can like put work into, get a result out of, and also at the same time find like a calming kind of experience in.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned the firewood, but as far as when we've been recording for the podcast, you didn't mention all of why. I mean, you're doing kind of like a homesteading thing. Tell us about that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So so I ran the recruiting station in Durango, Colorado, right? So for anybody that knows where Durango is, it's a small little mountain town, southwestern corner of the state of Colorado. The town itself, the town, well, it's a city, I guess. So the city of Durango is kind of in a high desert environment, is what it's classified as. That city's elevation is just over 6,000 feet, right? So when we first moved out there, we had moved from Boston, where I met my wife at. So she's a city girl, right? And we moved to Durango. And this was back, again, 2011. We had never been out west. I had never been out west before. We didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into. We didn't know what to expect. And when we were looking for a place to rent out there, because we couldn't afford to buy anything at that time, we were like on Craigslist, right? That's when Craigslist was still like the thing to use to look for a house, right? Crazy. And I found this place for rent, looked great. It was listed as a mountain home. And so we went back and forth with the guy that owned the house a couple of times over email, shared some photos, this and that. We left Boston and still hadn't like locked that in yet. So we went to my home in Columbus for a week for leave, the week of Thanksgiving in 2011. And while we were there, we were like, hey, let's just go ahead and pull the trigger on this. So I called the guy and I was like, hey, man, like, I think we want to rent your house. Can I fly out though and kind of, take a look at it? We'll go ahead and put a deposit on it. I'm going to go ahead and have all of my shit delivered out there, right? I'm going to schedule to have it all delivered out there. And as long as everything looks as good as what it looks like in these pictures, we'll be good to hook.
Right.
So I flew out. I flew out the day after Thanksgiving in 2011. So it was a Friday. Flew out there, showed up, looked at the house, and the first thought that I had was, wow, this is amazing, right? It's perfect. Now, this house was up in an area above a reservoir in Durango called Lemon Reservoir, mountain home, 9,000 feet of elevation. And so the next day I called the trucking company. I was like, yep, confirming, drop my truck here. This is where I want it to be at. Guy shows up the next day and he's like, I'm not going up that fucking road. Wouldn't drive up the road. Right. So he ended up parking and dropping this trailer with all of our stuff on it at the bottom of this hill. Now I'm there alone. Right. My wife is still in Ohio. So I go into town and I rent a U-Haul. I'm like, well, I'll just back the U-Haul up to this semi truck. I'll move my shit off the semi truck onto the U-Haul, and then I'll drive the U-Haul up to the house. So I loaded the U-Haul up and started to go up the road, and it had already snowed. So this is like November. There's already snow on the road, right? Dirt roads. So even though it had been plowed, there's still snowpack on the road. Yeah, I couldn't get the U-Haul up the road, right? So now I'm like, now what do I do? Well, I had rented to drive from the airport a minivan. So now I start unloading this truck and loading my shit into this minivan, piece by piece by piece, and making these trips up and down this road. And I did that for about 8 hours that first day. And I got altitude sickness so bad that I couldn't hardly function. Bad headache, nauseous, all the works. Because again, I'm coming from Boston, living on the ocean at sea level to 9,000 feet.
Crazy.
Eventually ended up getting everything moved in. Took me a couple of days, got everything up there, flew back to Ohio, got in the Jeep with the wife, drove across the country. It took 3 days to drive from Ohio to Durango. As we pulled into Durango, Stephanie goes, I don't feel so good. And she was sick, like with the flu and the whole nine for like 4 days, right? Spent like 4 days just laying on the floor because there was nothing set up in the house yet.
Yeah.
The first time that I took her out of that house, she doesn't remember driving to the house. That's how sick she was, right? The first time that I took her out of that house and drove her down that road, she was super pissed. She was like, I can't believe you moved me out here. What are we going to do? There's no way that I'm going to be able to survive here. All of the catastrophizing that you can possibly imagine.
Right.
But, of course, hey, we're in this lease now for a year. We don't have a choice. You're going to have to get used to it, hon. Sorry about your luck. And she did, right? And she fell in love with it. And so we left there in 2014 and we moved to Cleveland. I took over a recruiting station in Cleveland. And, I had never once felt any kind of symptoms of homesickness ever when I was in the Army until I left Durango.
Crazy.
And then she felt the same thing. She never really missed Boston after she kind of got used to living there on the mountainside after a few months. But when we went to Cleveland, we both looked at each other one day and we're like, this is miserable. We're just not happy back on the East Coast. And so we set a goal for ourselves, right? And the goal was we will eventually end up back in Durango. Whether that's at retirement or before, somehow, some way, we're going to get back here. So again, while we were at the academy, so a lot happened in the academy time frame, right? So I started flying airplanes, and she said, I'm saving. We're going to really buckle down, and we're going to save. Our goal was to save $35,000 in the next 3 months to be able to put a down payment on a house. Yeah. And so she started looking, and we found this house in a town just east of Durango, in a town called Bayfield, and found it online on Zillow. And again, COVID stuff, we were kind of in a lockdown at Fort Bliss, weren't allowed to leave, and we bought the house sight unseen. So we took a big old risk, right? Yep. It's a nice little A-frame home. It's only about 900 square foot. It's in the middle of nothing but huge, pine trees, ponderosa pines all the way around. And now, that's kind of where we're going to end up at. So it's heated by wood in the wintertime. So hence, cutting our own firewood. People are like, oh, can't you just buy firewood? And yeah, I sure can at $600 a cord. Or I can cut 10 cords using permits that I buy for $60. So, it just takes a little bit of work.
Yeah. That's an amazing story, man. It's funny that I actually moved to Montana from Cleveland, Ohio, from Minnesota.
Oh, really?
But I was in Cleveland, and Cleveland, when you don't have Montana and the Rockies, Cleveland isn't bad at all, man. It's beautiful. I love the lake. I love Lake Erie. The atmosphere there, you feel like you're at the ocean almost in the summer. But when you come to Montana, in your case Colorado, it is just a different world out here. And I think it just something clicked in my soul and said, this is where I need to be.
Yeah, it was definitely one of those types of scenarios for us, man. And if you don't already live in Colorado or Montana, I mean, it's terrible. Like, just don't come out there. But no,
it is so bad. I don't know about all these travel agencies sending people here when Yellowstone doesn't reflect well at all. It is terrible here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So.
Oh man, I love that. The anti-Rockies campaign, right? Just get people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And hey, you know what? You want to move to Colorado? That's fine. Just move to Denver.
Yep. That's the cool place to be, right? So
That's right.
Bozeman's overrun. Um, that's good stuff, man. I love like the holistic. You guys just seem to really live from a holistic place, and I don't know if that clicks for you when I say that, but maybe you haven't thought of it that way. But that's how it comes across to me. You really live from your heart, and that's awesome. And your wife seems to be on the same page, which is hard to find in a partner sometimes, right? So
Yeah, and I mean, Stephanie is funny, right? Because again, from Boston, she tells people all the time, until I moved to Colorado, I thought all meat just came in cellophane, right? She had never been, her family, not hunters, right? Not people that are outdoors types of people. Um, and so like the first time that when we were in Colorado, the first time I had gone out to elk hunt, and I was bow hunting, and sat outside all day, and came back, kind of was walking back at dusk, and I kicked up some grouse, and so I was like, well, good target of opportunity. So I pulled out my pistol and shot a couple of grouse, and I had them tied to my backpack, and I came home and walked over to the back porch, and she comes out and she goes, "Did you see anything?" And I was like, "Well, I didn't see any elk." And she looked at my backpack and she saw these birds hanging off my backpack, and she goes, what the fuck is that?" And I was like, "Well, the grouse." And she's like, "Well, yeah, but what are you gonna do with them?" I was like, "Oh, we're gonna eat these." And she was like, she didn't know what to do. But now, again, like through this experience and through her own personal growth, this year, she put in for a couple of tags for the draw this year, and she drew a mule doe tag. And this girl is so excited to go out and hunt mule deer this year. It's crazy.
that's awesome.
So she's all about it now. So she's got all of her own, she's got all of her own hunting gear. She's got all the First Light gear, and her own rifle, and I'll tell you, she's really good because she's super determined and very patient, which is what you have to be a good hunter. So
Yeah. No, I'm excited for her. That'd be awesome. Is that her first would that be her first mule deer kill?
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So she's hunted elk a couple of times now. She hasn't ever gotten anything, but uh, the muley tag this year, I'm pretty sure she's going to probably be able to bag a muley deer where we live at. It's almost kind of like one of those ones where it's like, I don't want to say that I got meat in the freezer yet, but it's pretty good possibility. And she's a hell of a shot too. She can outshoot me on any day, and she's always been good with firearms. So she loves to shoot guns. So.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Was there anything else you want to add from, on anything we talked about? This I'm every episode we get from episode 1 talking strictly about running, because that's who our first episode was on, a guy who's a veteran, and we talked about running and being a veteran and all these things. But every episode gets more and more rich about people's just stories, you know, and less about like this race or anything. Obviously we're doing this because we have the Revenant is that race coming up in August, but
Yeah.
I just love hearing your story, man, and the fact that you were a runner kind of got us on the call today. But what an epic story! I feel like that's so inspiring to a lot of people. Anything else you would add to any aspect, like last words for people watching?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that you just got to kind of find what makes you happy. And I think that that's kind of just a journey, right? Like, and don't be afraid to go out and try different new things that maybe you never would have thought that you would have done before. And I've kind of done all of these different things. I was never a runner, until I went to Cleveland. And then I met some dudes there. One of them is actually sitting across from me right now, that, are runners. It was one of those things to where when I first really started getting into it, I was not good at it at all. And then kind of through persistence and perseverance, you start to see progress. And maybe you have some setbacks along the way. I just recently had one. I tore my left calf muscle about 10 weeks ago, and I'm still kind of dealing with some shit with that. But I think that if people would understand that, like, there is so much to life outside of just sitting at a TV or playing a video game all day, those things are great and they have a place. But the wider world is just so much more than that. And people really kind of limit themselves, I think, if they don't go out and they don't explore, you know, things that are beyond what they normally would have envisioned themselves ever doing.
I mean, yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. So yeah, thanks for being on the episode, man. I appreciate the story. Good stuff, and I hope people take a lot from it.
All right, man. Thanks. I appreciate you.